October. Rain had been falling over Ashbury Creek since before sunrise, not the violent kind of rain that came with thunder and broken branches. This rain was quieter, older somehow, the kind that wrapped around a town gently, soaking into brick walls, rusted railings, and tired wooden porches that had seen too many autumns. Thomas Whitaker stood at the kitchen sink with both hands wrapped around a chipped coffee mug. The clock above the refrigerator ticked loudly in the silence. 5:43 a.m. Every morning in the house sounded the same now. The low hum of the refrigerator, the distant whistle of freight trains somewhere beyond the trees, the groan of old pipes, and the rain. Always the rain in October. Tom stared out the fog kitchen window toward the backyard, where yellow leaves clung weakly to the maple tree Helen had planted 30 years ago. Most of the leaves had already fallen. They covered the grass in damp patches of golden brown. He took a slow sip of black coffee. Cold already, he no longer noticed. The kitchen still looked almost exactly the way his wife had left it 7 years earlier. The floral curtains, the faded recipe cards taped near the stove, the little ceramic rooster beside the sugar jar. Even her reading glasses still rested on the windowsill. Sometimes he moved them, then moved them back, as if she might come looking for them. The old radio on the counter crackled softly with a weather report. Temperatures expected to remain in the low 50s throughout Ashbury County. Tom barely listened. He had spent 40 years behind a microphone himself, long enough to recognize the tired voice of a man pretending not to feel lonely before dawn. He turned the radio off. The silence returned immediately, heavy, familiar. For a while he simply stood there staring into the rain. Then his eyes drifted toward the back door. The garage. He had been meaning to clean it for months, maybe longer. Helen used to complain about the boxes. "You keep every piece of your life in there, Tommy." She had laughed when she said it. Now the thought of opening those boxes made his chest tighten. But something about the weather made the house feel smaller that morning. So he grabbed his old denim jacket from the chair, slipped it over his flannel shirt, and stepped outside. The cold air smelled like wet leaves and rust. The wooden porch creaked beneath his boots. Somewhere nearby, a wind chime clinked softly in the rain. The garage sat behind the house, beside the narrow gravel driveway. Its white paint had peeled away years ago, exposing grey-tired wood underneath. One of the doors always stuck during damp weather. Tom shoved it open with his shoulder. The smell hit him immediately. Dust, motor oil, old paper, wet cardboard, time itself. Weak morning light filtered through the small dirty windows, revealing towers of forgotten boxes stacked against the walls. Helen's Christmas decorations, fishing gear, broken lamps, vinyl crates, old station equipment from WACR 101.7. Tom exhaled slowly. "Well," he muttered to himself, "suppose it's time." His voice sounded strange in the empty garage. He started small, one box at a time. Old magazines, tax records, cassette tapes, hundreds of cassette tapes. Most were labeled in faded marker. Summer 82, late night broadcast, county fair, Helen singing. His hand slowed. He picked up one tape carefully. Helen singing. For a moment he considered putting it aside untouched. Instead, he closed his eyes and slipped it into an old portable cassette player sitting nearby on the workbench. Static hissed softly. Then Helen's voice filled the garage, young, warm, laughing before she started singing. Tom lowered his head immediately. His throat tightened. "Lord," he whispered. The tape clicked off after less than a minute. He removed it carefully, like it might break apart in his hands. Outside, rain tapped steadily against the roof. He continued searching. Minutes passed, maybe an hour. Then he found it, a plain grey cassette. No label, no writing, nothing. Just an old strip of cracked plastic. Tom frowned slightly. That's strange. He turned it over in his weathered hands. No memory came immediately. Still, something about it felt familiar. He slid the tape into the player, pressed play. At first there was only static. A soft hiss, then a guitar, gentle, melancholic, warm like fading sunlight through autumn trees. Tom froze completely. The melody drifted through the garage slowly, almost fragile. Then the voice began singing, "Carry me home through the cold October rain." Tom's breath caught instantly. His fingers tightened around the workbench. No, it couldn't be. The song continued. And if the lights go dark in Ashbury Creek. Tom stumbled backward into the chair behind him. The cassette player crackled softly as the music filled the dusty garage. His eyes widened with disbelief. He had not heard that voice in over 40 years, not since his chest tightened painfully. Outside, a train horn echoed through town, and suddenly the garage disappeared. 1974 flooded back all at once. Summer lights, warm air, crowds laughing, a girl in a blue dress spinning beneath hanging lanterns, vinyl records, teenagers dancing, the old radio station glowing at midnight, and that song, that impossible song. Tom covered his mouth with one trembling hand. The years collapsed around him. Every memory he had buried beneath silence came rushing back like flood water breaking through a dam. He could almost smell cigarette smoke and summer pavement again. Could almost hear Helen laughing somewhere nearby. Could almost see him. The boy with the guitar. The boy nobody spoke about anymore. Tom sat there in the dim garage while rain drummed overhead. The cassette kept playing softly. And every road we leave behind still leads us back someday. His eyes filled slowly. Then finally, after 7 years of holding everything inside, Thomas Whitaker began to cry, not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly, the way lonely people cry when nobody's watching. And outside, Ashbury Creek kept disappearing beneath the cold October rain. The rain had stopped by noon, but the sky above Ashbury Creek remained heavy and grey. The streets shimmered with leftover water. Old neon signs buzzed weakly in diner windows. Leaves gathered along sidewalks and storm drains. Tom drove slowly through town in his fade green Ford pickup, the cassette resting carefully on the passenger seat beside him. He glanced at it every few seconds, as if afraid it might vanish. The song had played in his head all morning. Every note, every lyric fragment, every memory. 40 years buried beneath silence, and somehow the tape had survived. Ashbury Creek looked smaller than it used to, or maybe older. Main Street had once been crowded every Saturday morning. Families filled the sidewalks, factory workers stopped at Miller's Diner before shifts, teenagers gathered outside the old cinema with milkshakes and cigarettes. Now half the storefronts were empty. The hardware store had closed 3 winters ago. The movie theatre only opened on weekends. Even the diner looked tired. Tom stopped at a red light. Nobody else seemed to need any more. A group of elderly men sat outside the barber shop beneath the striped awning, drinking coffee from paper cups. One of them nodded slowly as Tom passed. People still recognized his truck. They still remembered his voice, even if they barely spoke anymore. At the end of Main Street stood the old brick building that housed WACR 101.7. The station looked exactly like Tom remembered, and nothing like it used to. The once bright station sign had faded from blue to pale grey. The windows needed paint. One of the letters in the neon open sign no longer worked. Tom parked slowly. For a moment he simply sat there, gripping the steering wheel. He had retired 3 years earlier, hadn't planned on coming back. But the cassette beside him felt heavier than memory. It felt unfinished. Inside the station smelled exactly the same. Coffee, dust, warm electronics, old carpet, time. The hallway lights hummed softly overhead. Framed photographs lined the walls. Local baseball teams, Christmas charity drives, county fairs, old radio contests. Tom paused at one picture from 1978. He recognized nearly every face, most of them gone now. Tom? He turned, a younger voice. Dylan Mercer stepped out of Studio B, holding headphones around his neck. Holy hell, Dylan said with a grin. Didn't expect to see you today. Tom smiled faintly. Could say the same about you still working here. Dylan laughed. Somebody's got to keep this place alive. They shook hands. Tom noticed immediately how young Dylan's hands felt compared to his own. You doing all right? Dylan asked. Tom nodded once. Found something? Dylan raised an eyebrow. That mysterious, huh? Tom reached into his jacket pocket and carefully held up the cassette. Dylan blinked. A tape. Found it in my garage. What's on it? Tom looked toward the studio window. His voice lowered slightly. I think it's him. The smile disappeared from Dylan's face. Even younger people in Ashbury Creek knew the stories. Not all the details, but enough. The song? Dylan asked quietly. Tom nodded. For a second neither man spoke. Only the distant hum of studio equipment filled the hallway. Then Dylan opened the studio door slowly. Well, he said softly, guess we better hear it. Studio A looked frozen in time. Old microphones, wood panelling, coffee stains, stacks of records, a faded Eagles poster near the soundboard. Tom stepped inside slowly, memories pressing against him from every corner. How many nights had he spent in this room? Thousands, maybe more. Dylan inserted the cassette carefully. Static filled the speakers. Then the guitar began again. Soft, haunting, beautiful. Dylan leaned back slowly in his chair. Wow! Tom said nothing. The song filled the studio with ghosts. And if the lights go dark in Ashbury Creek? Dylan stared toward the speakers. I've heard people talk about this song my whole life. Tom swallowed hard. Most thought it wasn't real anymore. The final note faded softly. Silence followed, long silence. Then Dylan quietly reached toward the console. What are you doing? Tom asked. Dylan hesitated. I think people deserve to hear this. Before Tom could answer, Dylan pressed the broadcast button. The on-air light glowed red instantly, and the song drifted out across Ashbury Creek for the first time in over 40 years. At first, nothing happened. The song simply floated through kitchens, garages, diners, pickup trucks, and quiet living rooms all across town. Then the phones began ringing, one line, then another, then all of them. Dylan stared at the switchboard. You've got to be kidding me. Tom's heart pounded. Dylan answered the first call. WACR, you're on the air. A woman's trembling voice came through the speakers. Where did you find that song? Dylan looked at Tom. Mom. Oh my God, the woman whispered. I danced to this song with my husband in 1975. Her voice broke completely. The line disconnected. Another call immediately came through. An older man this time. I thought that tape was gone forever. Another. My brother used to play this every summer. Another. I haven't heard that voice since high school. Another. Please play it again. The station became flooded with emotion. Tom sat silently beside the console while memories poured through the phone lines. Some callers laughed, some cried, some could barely speak at all. One elderly woman whispered, You have no idea what this town used to sound like. That sentence stayed with Tom. Outside, Ashbury Creek continued through its grey afternoon. But something had changed. At Miller's Diner, conversation stopped when the song came on. At the gas station, a mechanic stood motionless beside an open hood. An elderly couple sat in their parked Buick outside the pharmacy, listening with tears in their eyes. Even people too young to know the story felt something shift in the air, like the town itself had suddenly remembered an old dream. Inside the station, Dylan slowly removed his headphones. This isn't normal, he whispered. Tom looked toward the studio window. Across the street, people had begun gathering outside, watching the station, talking quietly, waiting. The cassette rested beside the soundboard. Silent now, but somehow alive. Tom stared at it uneasily, because deep down, beneath the warmth and nostalgia and tears, something else had returned with that song, something unfinished, and for the first time in decades, Thomas Whitaker felt afraid of the past. By the time Noah Bennett crossed the Pennsylvania state line, the sky had already begun dissolving into the muted silver tones of late afternoon, and the endless stretches of highway unfolding ahead of him seemed to carry none of the urgency, noise, or restless ambition that had defined nearly every year of his adult life in Chicago. He drove with one hand loosely resting on the steering wheel of his aging Ford Explorer, while the other tapped absently against a paper coffee cup that had gone cold nearly an hour earlier, although he continued drinking it anyway out of habit more than desire, because somewhere along the line he had become the kind of man who forgot that coffee was supposed to taste good and not merely keep him awake long enough to finish another deadline. The city still lingered in his mind like static. Chicago had become exhausting in ways Noah could no longer properly explain to people without sounding ungrateful or cynical, because on paper his life looked respectable enough. Articles in national magazines, interviews with politicians and celebrities, invitations to media events, expensive apartments with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking streets that never truly slept. And yet, over the past few years, he had developed the strange and unsettling feeling that he was constantly surrounded by people while simultaneously becoming more disconnected from humanity itself. Every story had begun sounding the same. Another scandal, another disaster, another headline designed to disappear within 24 hours. Even his recent divorce had unfolded with the same cold efficiency that modern life seemed to demand from everything else, as though heartbreak itself had become something people squeezed awkwardly between work meetings and social obligations before quietly moving on. And so, when his editor assigned him a small feature about the economic decline of forgotten industrial towns across Pennsylvania, Noah accepted mostly because he needed an excuse to leave Chicago for a few days before the city swallowed what little patience he still possessed. He had expected Ashbury Creek to be depressing, a dying little town with empty factories and tired people, another place America forgot. At first glance, that assumption did not seem entirely wrong. As Noah drove beneath the faded wooden welcome sign entering town, he noticed rows of old brick storefronts standing beneath heavy autumn clouds while rust-colored leaves tumbled across nearly empty streets in slow swirling circles, and although there was something undeniably beautiful about the place, there was also an unmistakable sadness hanging over everything, like the town had once been full of noise and laughter before gradually becoming quieter, year after year, until silence itself had settled permanently into the cracks of the sidewalks. He slowed near Main Street. An old movie theatre stood beside a pharmacy with fading paint peeling around its windows, while across the street a diner with fogged-up glass displayed a flickering neon sign that buzzed softly against the darkening afternoon. Noah parked near the curb and stepped outside. The cold air surprised him immediately, not because it was particularly freezing, but because it carried a kind of clean stillness that no longer existed in cities, where every breath usually tasted faintly of exhaust fumes, overheated pavement, and hurried lives. Here, the air smelled like rain-soaked leaves, chimney smoke, and distant pine trees. For a moment, he simply stood there listening. A train horn echoed somewhere beyond town. Wind rustled through bare branches overhead, and from inside the diner came the faint sound of old country music playing through worn ceiling speakers. Noah pulled his jacket tighter and walked inside. The warmth hit him first, then the smell. Coffee, bacon grease, apple pie, old wood polished so many times over decades that the booth seemed permanently soaked with memory. Several elderly men sat at the counter, drinking coffee while discussing high school football with the seriousness of military strategists. And near the window, an older couple shared fries in complete silence, though the comfortable kind of silence that only people married for 40 years seemed capable of understanding. Noah slid into a booth and opened his notebook. The waitress approached, carrying a coffee pot. "You passing through?" she asked. "Something like that," Noah replied. "You hear about the factory?" He nodded. "That obvious?" She smiled faintly while filling his cup. "People only come here these days for 2 reasons," she said. "Factory stories or family funerals." Noah almost laughed. Almost. Then he noticed something unusual. Every television inside the diner had been muted, yet nearly everyone in the room seemed distracted by the same conversation happening quietly between booths. People kept mentioning a song, an old song. Someone at the counter suddenly said, "They played it yesterday afternoon. Swear to God I nearly drove off the road when I heard it." Another man shook his head slowly. "I thought that tape disappeared after 78. Noah looked up immediately. His instincts sharpened. Stories often revealed themselves in fragments long before anyone realized they were telling one. "What song?" Noah asked casually. The room grew unexpectedly quiet. Several people glanced toward him. One of the older men studied Noah carefully before answering. "You ain't from here, are you?" "No, Chicago." That seemed to explain everything. The man leaned back slowly. "There used to be a song everybody in this town knew," he said quietly. "Long time ago." Noah waited, but the man stopped there. The waitress placed a slice of apple pie on the table beside Noah. "You'll hear about it eventually," she murmured softly. That sentence lingered strangely in Noah's mind. Eventually, as though the town itself had been waiting for someone to ask. Later that evening, after checking into a small roadside motel near the edge of town, Noah sat by the window, reviewing notes, while rainwater slid slowly down the glass outside, blurring the street lights into long golden streaks. He should have been outlining questions about unemployment rates and factory closures. Instead, he found himself writing the same phrase repeatedly across the top of his notebook. The song everyone remembers. He did not yet understand why the story mattered, but he could already feel something beneath it. Something old, something unfinished. And somewhere across town, inside a dimly lit house beside the railroad tracks, Thomas Whitaker sat alone on his porch, listening to the cassette once again, while memories he had spent decades burying slowly began returning to life. Long before Ashbury Creek became quiet enough for people to hear loneliness in the wind, before storefront windows darkened permanently and factory whistles stopped echoing across the valley at dawn, the town had once belonged to music, laughter, and the intoxicating belief that life was still beginning for everyone standing beneath its glowing summer skies. The summer of 1974 arrived hot and golden. The kind of summer people remembered decades later, not because of one particular event, but because everything about those months seemed touched by a strange kind of brightness that only exists before adulthood fully introduces itself through grief, disappointment, and time. Back then, Main Street still pulsed with life from morning until midnight. Children rode bicycles between parked Chevrolets, while mothers carried shopping bags beneath striped awnings, and factory workers filled diners after long shifts, their voices booming through open windows alongside the sound of jukeboxes playing the Eagles, James Taylor, and Fleetwood Mac. Every Friday night, teenagers gathered near Cedar Lake, where pickup trucks lined the shoreline, and portable radios played music loud enough to drift across the dark water, while couples danced barefoot on the grass beneath strings of coloured festival lights. And at the centre of all of it was the Ashbury Summer Fair. For 1 week every August, the entire town transformed. The empty field near the old baseball grounds filled with Ferris wheels, food stands, carnival games, music stages, and glowing lanterns that turned the warm evening air into something almost magical, especially for young people still discovering how easily a single summer night could convince them the world would remain beautiful forever. Thomas Whitaker was 19 years old that summer. Tall, awkward, thin as a fence post, with dark hair constantly falling into his eyes and fingers that smelled permanently of vinyl records because he spent nearly every free hour volunteering at WACR 101.7, where he dreamed of one day becoming a real radio host instead of simply carrying equipment and organizing music shelves. On the opening night of the fair, Tom walked through the crowded grounds carrying 2 milkshakes, while trying unsuccessfully not to stare at Helen Parker, who walked beside him wearing a white blouse and denim skirt, while laughing at something he had said several minutes earlier. Tom could barely focus whenever Helen laughed. Her laughter always sounded fearless. "You're doing it again," Helen teased. "Doing what?" "Thinking too hard." Tom smiled nervously. "I wasn't thinking." "That's even worse." The warm summer air smelled like popcorn, grilled onions, gasoline from carnival generators, and freshly cut grass still holding heat from the afternoon sun. Children ran past carrying cotton candy, while somewhere nearby a local band played a slightly off-key version of Take It Easy through crackling speakers. Everything felt alive. Tom remembered thinking, not for the last time that summer, that he never wanted to leave Ashbury Creek. They reached the lakeside just as sunset melted across the water in deep shades of orange and gold. Small boats drifted lazily near the shore, while teenagers skipped stones beneath hanging lanterns reflected in the lake like trembling stars. And that was when Tom first saw him. The boy sat alone on the back steps behind the small festival stage, holding a weathered acoustic guitar across his lap, while quietly adjusting the tuning pegs with the calm concentration of someone completely unaware of the noise surrounding him. He looked slightly older than Tom, early 20s maybe, dark brown hair, denim jacket, worn boots, a face carrying the kind of sadness that somehow made people look older and younger at the same time. Tom slowed instinctively. "Who's that?" he asked. Helen followed his gaze. "Oh," she said quietly, "that's Daniel." "Daniel who?" "Nobody knows much about him." Tom frowned. "What's he doing here?" Helen hesitated briefly. "Playing tonight, I think." "Ah." The young man lifted his head then, and for one brief second his eyes met Tom's across the crowded fairgrounds. There was nothing dramatic about the moment, No sudden revelation, no cinematic recognition, and yet something about the expression in Daniel's eyes unsettled Tom immediately, because beneath the noise and lights and laughter surrounding them, the young musician carried himself with the strange stillness of someone listening to a completely different world than everyone else. A few minutes later, the festival lights brightened as evening settled fully over Ashbury Creek, and people slowly gathered near the small wooden stage where local performers usually played cheerful country songs before the fireworks began. Teenagers crowded near the front. Parents unfolded lawn chairs. Children sat cross-legged on blankets, eating funnel cakes dusted with powdered sugar. The announcer adjusted the microphone. "All right, folks," he said cheerfully. "Before the fireworks begin, we've got a young man here, visiting from out west, who says he's written something special for tonight." Scattered applause followed. Daniel walked onto the stage, carrying only the guitar. No introduction, no smile, just quiet nervousness hidden beneath tired eyes. Tom stood near the edge of the crowd, holding his milkshake without drinking it, while warm wind drifted across the lake, carrying the smell of fireworks and summer grass. Daniel adjusted the microphone slowly. Then he began to play. The first guitar notes floated softly into the warm August night. Simple, gentle, but somehow powerful enough that conversations throughout the fairgrounds gradually faded away one by one until only the music remained. And when Daniel finally began singing, "Carry Me Home Through the Cold October Rain," something invisible seemed to pass through the crowd all at once. People stopped moving. Children looked up. Even the carnival sounds in the distance suddenly felt quieter. Tom felt his chest tighten for reasons he could not explain, because the song did not sound like ordinary music. It sounded like memory, like longing, like every beautiful thing people eventually lose without realizing the moment they are losing it. Beside him, Helen whispered softly, "Oh my God." The song continued beneath the glowing festival lights, while the warm summer night wrapped itself around Ashbury Creek like a promise nobody yet understood would someday break their hearts. And years later, long after the town forgot almost everything else about that summer, people would still remember exactly where they had been standing the first time they heard Daniel's voice. In later years, whenever people in Ashbury Creek tried to describe the summer of 1974, they rarely spoke first about the fireworks, the music, or the crowded festival grounds glowing beneath strings of coloured lanterns, because memory has a peculiar way of attaching itself not to the loudest moments in life, but to the quiet details that once seemed almost insignificant at the time. The sound of someone laughing beside a lake, the warmth of humid night air against bare skin, or the sight of a girl in a blue dress standing beneath carnival lights, while a song slowly changed the course of several lives all at once. For Tom Whitaker, that summer eventually became impossible to separate from Evelyn Harper, and for reasons he would spend decades trying not to think about too deeply, it also became impossible to separate from Daniel. The nights following the festival performance seemed to unfold differently than ordinary nights in Ashbury Creek. as though the entire town had unconsciously slipped into a softer rhythm after hearing that song for the first time, because suddenly people lingered longer on porches after sunset, radios played later into the evening, and conversations at diners kept circling back toward the mysterious young songwriter who had appeared almost out of nowhere, carrying a weathered guitar and eyes that looked older than the rest of him. Nobody knew much about Daniel. Some said he came from Ohio, others claimed Tennessee. One woman insisted he had once played in Nashville before disappearing after some kind of trouble, although nobody could explain what that meant, and in a town like Ashbury Creek, uncertainty often transformed itself into legend long before truth had the chance to arrive. What everyone agreed upon, however, was that his music carried something difficult to explain. The song lingered inside people. They caught themselves humming fragments while washing dishes, or driving to work, or standing in grocery store lines beneath flickering fluorescent lights. Even Tom found himself unable to think clearly after hearing it, and what unsettled him most was not the music itself, but the way Evelyn reacted whenever Daniel's name entered conversation. She became quieter, softer somehow, like someone carefully guarding a memory too fragile to expose fully to daylight. 3 evenings after the festival, Tom drove down to Cedar Lake just before sunset, hoping to clear his head after another long volunteer shift at the radio station, where older hosts had already begun joking that Ashbury Creek had finally discovered its own local Bob Dylan, though Tom privately felt the comparison missed something important, because Daniel's music did not sound rebellious or poetic in the usual ways people admired musicians during the 70s. It sounded lonely, beautifully lonely. The lake shimmered beneath the fading orange sky, while warm wind moved gently through the trees surrounding the shoreline, carrying with it the scent of water, pine needles, gasoline from distant boat motors, and cigarette smoke drifting from pickup trucks parked along the gravel road. Teenagers gathered near bonfires farther down the beach, while portable radios played softly in the background. But near the old wooden dock, the evening felt strangely calm, and there she was, Evelyn, standing alone at the end of the dock, wearing a soft blue dress that moved lightly in the wind while sunset reflections danced across the water around her. Tom slowed immediately. Even years later he would remember that exact image with painful clarity. The fading sunlight in her hair, the soft movement of the lake behind her, the way she seemed both completely present and impossibly distant at the same time. "You planning to stand there all night?" she asked without turning around. Tom smiled nervously and walked closer. "Didn't want to interrupt." "You weren't interrupting anything." He stepped beside her carefully, looking out across the lake where the last fishing boats drifted toward shore. For a few moments neither of them spoke. The silence between them felt comfortable, in the way only summer silences can feel when people are still young enough to believe there will always be more time later for the important conversations. Finally, Tom cleared his throat. "So," he said casually, "you know him?" Evelyn's expression shifted almost invisibly. "Daniel?" Tom nodded. A little. She smiled faintly while looking down at the water. "He's been staying at my aunt's boarding house near Maple Street." Tom tried not to sound too interested. "What's his story?" Evelyn hesitated. Then she leaned both elbows against the railing. "I don't think he tells people much." "That mysterious, huh?" Her smile faded slightly. "No," she said softly, "just sad." The word lingered between them. Sad. Tom glanced toward her. "You like him?" It came out before he could stop himself. Evelyn looked genuinely surprised, then amused. "Tom Whittaker." She laughed softly. "Are you jealous?" His face immediately reddened. "I didn't say that." "You didn't have to." She turned toward him then, and for a moment the fading sunlight caught her eyes in a way that made Tom suddenly forget every intelligent thought he had intended to say. But before either of them could continue, music drifted softly across the lake. A guitar. Both turned instinctively. Farther down the shoreline, sitting beside a small fire near the trees, Daniel played quietly, while several younger teenagers listened nearby in complete silence. Even from a distance, the melody felt intimate, private somehow, as though he were not performing for anyone at all. Evelyn watched him for several seconds before speaking again. "He writes songs the way some people write letters they never send." Tom frowned slightly. "What does that mean?" She kept watching Daniel. "It means every song sounds like he's trying to hold on to something that's already disappearing." The wind shifted softly across the lake. For reasons Tom could not explain, unease settled quietly into his chest. Not anger, not exactly jealousy, something more complicated, because for the first time in his life he realized music could make people fall in love with things they didn't fully understand. And watching Evelyn stare toward Daniel beneath the fading summer sky, Tom suddenly understood that the song was no longer simply a song. It was becoming part of people, part of the town itself. And somewhere deep inside, he sensed that nothing about that summer would end the way any of them expected. By late September, the song had spread through Ashbury Creek with the quiet inevitability of changing seasons, because although no official record store carried it, and no major station outside the county had ever played it, nearly everyone in town somehow knew the melody by heart, as though the music had slipped invisibly through open windows, front porches, diner booths, pickup truck radios, and warm summer conversations until it became woven into the emotional fabric of everyday life itself. People requested it constantly at local dances. Teenagers scribbled fragments of lyrics onto school notebooks. Factory workers hummed the chorus during lunch breaks. And every evening, just before sunset, someone somewhere in town inevitably played the song loudly enough for neighbors to hear drifting through the streets beneath the cooling autumn air. But despite the growing fascination surrounding the music, Daniel himself remained strangely distant from the attention. He played occasionally at the diner on weekends, sometimes at the lake, sometimes during local gatherings. Yet he never seemed comfortable performing for crowds, and whenever conversations turned too personal or people asked direct questions about his past, he smiled politely before disappearing for several days at a time, as though certain parts of his life existed behind doors he refused to let anyone open. Tom noticed all of this carefully, partly because he admired Daniel, partly because he distrusted the sadness living behind his eyes, and partly because Evelyn had begun spending more time with him. Not openly romantic, not officially, but enough that Tom could feel the shift every time the three of them occupied the same room together. Evelyn laughed differently around Daniel, softer, more thoughtful, as though she listened to him with emotions she herself did not fully understand. By October, the evenings in Ashbury Creek had grown colder, and the trees lining Main Street burned deep shades of orange and crimson beneath street lights that flickered on earlier each day, while dry leaves scraped softly across sidewalks in the evening wind. One Thursday night, shortly after 11 p.m., Tom sat alone inside Studio A at WACR 101.7, filling in for an older overnight host recovering from surgery. The station always felt different after midnight. During daytime hours, the building buzzed with telephones, commercials, local news and conversation, but overnight the rooms transformed into something quieter and almost sacred, where the soft glow of equipment lights and the low hum of electronics created the strange illusion that the rest of the world had temporarily disappeared beyond the studio walls. Tom loved those hours, always had. The coffee tasted worse at night. The silence felt heavier, but radio somehow became more honest after midnight, because lonely people listened differently in darkness than they did during daylight. Outside, rain drifted lightly through the empty streets, while neon reflections shimmered across wet pavement beneath the station windows. Inside the booth, cigarette smoke from the previous host still lingered faintly in the air, alongside the familiar scent of warm vinyl, dusty records, and old electrical equipment. Tom leaned back in his chair while a soft country song faded through the headphones resting around his neck. He glanced at the clock. 12:17 a.m. The town was sleeping, mostly. Then the studio door opened quietly. Tom looked up. Daniel stood there, holding his guitar case beneath the dim hallway light. For a second neither spoke. "You're out late," Tom finally said. Daniel smiled faintly. "So are you." Tom gestured toward the empty chair nearby. "You need something?" Daniel stepped inside slowly while removing a cassette tape from his jacket pocket. "I recorded a cleaner version," he said quietly. Tom stared at the tape. "The song?" Daniel nodded. Rain tapped softly against the windows. Tom hesitated before taking it. "You sure about this?" Daniel looked toward the dark studio glass where their reflections floated faintly against the night. "I don't know," he admitted honestly, "but songs aren't meant to stay hidden forever." There was something exhausted in his voice, not physical exhaustion, the deeper kind, like someone carrying memories too heavy to explain. Tom inserted the cassette carefully into the deck. Static crackled softly. Then the guitar began. This version sounded richer than the festival performance, more intimate. Every lyric carried warmth and heartbreak all at once. Tom listened in silence while the song filled the studio. "And every road we leave behind still leads us back someday." Daniel lowered his eyes slightly. My mother used to sing while cleaning the house, he said unexpectedly. Old folk songs mostly. Tom glanced toward him. She's still around? A long pause followed. No. The answer arrived quietly enough that Tom immediately regretted asking. Outside, wind rattled loose leaves across the parking lot. Inside the booth, the song continued beneath the soft amber glow of studio lights. Then Tom made a decision that would quietly alter Ashbury Creek forever. He reached toward the console. Daniel frowned slightly. What are you doing? Tom smiled nervously. Giving the town something worth remembering. Before Daniel could respond, the red-on AR light illuminated the studio in warm crimson, and at exactly 12:26 a.m. on an ordinary rainy Thursday night in October 1974, October Rain played across Ashbury Creek for the very first time on live radio. The song drifted through sleeping neighborhoods, lonely kitchens, truck cabs, hospital waiting rooms, gas stations, and quiet front porches where exhausted factory workers sat smoking cigarettes before bed while the cold autumn rain whispered softly through the darkened town. Some listeners stopped moving entirely. Some turned the volume higher. Some simply sat in silence afterward, without fully understanding why their hearts suddenly ached. And inside Studio A, while the final notes faded gently into the Pennsylvania night, Tom looked toward Daniel and realized the young songwriter appeared frightened rather than proud, as though hearing his own music travel across the town had awakened something he had hoped would never follow him to Ashbury Creek. Then, just before the song ended completely, the station phone rang. Once, then again, and again. Tom stared at the flashing lines while a strange feeling settled into the room, because neither of them yet understood that from this moment forward the song would no longer belong only to Daniel. It now belonged to the town, and towns, unlike people, never truly forget the things that once helped them survive loneliness. There are certain nights that remain suspended in memory long after every ordinary detail surrounding them has faded away, nights that seem at first no different from countless others, before gradually revealing themselves as invisible dividing lines between one life and another. And for the people of Ashbury Creek, the night Daniel vanished became one of those moments that older residents would still speak about decades later in lowered voices while staring absently through diner windows at falling rain. It happened during the final week of October in 1974, when autumn had fully settled across the valley and the trees surrounding Ashbury Creek stood nearly bare beneath cold grey skies, while wind swept dry leaves through empty streets with the lonely sound of paper dragging across concrete. For several days beforehand, the weather had grown increasingly unsettled. Heavy clouds rolled low above town. Rain came and went in restless bursts. The railroad tracks behind Main Street gleamed silver beneath constant moisture, and every evening the air carried the sharp metallic scent that always arrived shortly before storms severe enough to make old houses creak through the night. Daniel had become quieter during those days, even quieter than usual. Tom noticed it first during an evening at Miller's Diner where several local teenagers gathered around the jukebox while Daniel sat alone near the back window, nursing a cup of coffee he barely touched, his fingers tracing absent circles along the rim of the mug while rainwater slid slowly down the glass behind him. Usually, even when withdrawn, he still listened attentively whenever people spoke around him, but lately his attention seemed fixed somewhere far beyond the walls of the diner, as though he kept hearing distant thoughts nobody else could reach. Evelyn noticed it too. One night after closing choir practice at the church, she found Daniel sitting alone on the front steps beneath the yellow glow of a flickering street lamp while cold wind moved through the trees overhead, carrying loose leaves across the sidewalk around his boots. "You're disappearing again," she said softly while sitting beside him. Daniel smiled faintly without looking up. "That obvious? You haven't slept in days." For several seconds he said nothing. Then finally he leaned back against the railing and stared toward the dark, empty street. "Do you ever feel," he asked quietly, "like some places let you forget who you used to be?" Evelyn studied him carefully. "Ashbury Creek feels that way to you?" "For the first time in a long while." She hesitated. "Then why do you look so afraid?" That question lingered heavily between them. Daniel lowered his eyes, and although Evelyn would later spend years replaying that exact moment in her memory, searching desperately for signs she should have recognized sooner, all she remembered clearly was the overwhelming sadness in his expression when he finally answered, "Because eventually the past catches up with everyone." 2 days later the storm arrived. By late evening, rain hammered Ashbury Creek so violently that most businesses closed early, while thunder rolled continuously through the valley like distant collapsing buildings, rattling windows throughout town and sending people hurrying indoors beneath flickering street lights. At WACR 101.7, Tom remained late organizing music archives, while static crackled constantly through the radio equipment, because storms always interfered with transmission signals during bad weather. The station felt unusually empty that night. Even the hallway lights seemed dimmer beneath the constant drumming rain. Around 10:40 p.m. the phone rang unexpectedly. Tom answered absent-mindedly. WACR. Silence, then breathing, weak, uneven. "Tom?" He immediately recognized the voice. "Daniel?" Another burst of static interrupted the line. "Listen to me carefully," Daniel said quietly, almost urgently. "If anyone asks about me tomorrow—" The connection crackled violently. "Daniel, where are you?" "I shouldn't have stayed here this long." Thunder exploded somewhere overhead. Tom stood immediately. "What are you talking about?" For a moment only rain filled the line. Then Daniel spoke again, softer this time. "Thank you for playing the song." The line went dead. Tom stared at the receiver. A strange coldness spread slowly through his chest. Outside, rain battered the station windows hard enough to blur the entire parking lot into shifting grey shadows. Without fully understanding why, Tom grabbed his jacket and rushed outside. The storm hit him instantly. Cold rain soaked through his clothes within seconds, while violent winds scattered leaves across the pavement in frantic spirals beneath flashing street lights. He drove first to the boarding house on Maple Street. Daniel's room was empty, the bed untouched, guitar gone. Then he drove to Cedar Lake. Nothing, only rain crashing against black water. By midnight, rumors had already begun spreading quietly through town. Some claimed Daniel had been seen near the highway heading west. Others insisted he argued with someone outside the diner earlier that evening. One man swore he saw an unfamiliar black car parked near the boarding house before the storm intensified. Nobody knew what was true, and by morning Daniel was simply gone. No goodbye, no explanation, nothing except silence. The town changed after that. Not immediately. At first people assumed he would return within days, then weeks. But as autumn faded into winter and winter slowly surrendered to spring, realization settled painfully over Ashbury Creek that the young songwriter who had somehow become woven into the emotional life of the town had disappeared as mysteriously as he arrived. Still, the song remained. Tom continued playing it occasionally on late-night broadcasts. People requested it constantly, yet every time the melody drifted through town, it carried a different feeling now. Not just nostalgia, loss, and eventually, because people cannot endlessly carry unanswered questions without trying to protect themselves from them, the town stopped speaking openly about Daniel altogether. The song survived, the boy did not, and years later, whenever storms rolled across Ashbury Creek after dark, Thomas Whitaker still found himself listening unconsciously for the sound of a telephone ringing through static. Time rarely destroys places all at once. Instead, towns like Ashbury Creek disappear slowly enough that the people living inside them often fail to notice the loss until entire decades have already slipped away, because emptiness arrives quietly, one closed storefront at a time, one family moving away after another, one abandoned house left dark through winter, until eventually silence becomes so common that nobody remembers what the streets once sounded like when life still filled them completely. By the spring of 2025, Ashbury Creek no longer resembled the lively industrial town people remembered from old photographs stored inside dusty family albums. The factory near the railroad tracks, once powerful enough to shake windows across half the valley every morning at 6 o'clock sharp, had been closed for nearly 12 years now, leaving behind only rusted fencing, broken windows, and enormous silent buildings that stood like tired monuments to a version of America slowly disappearing from memory. Main Street had grown quieter too. Miller's Diner still survived somehow, although fewer customers arrived each year, and the old movie theatre now opened only Friday evenings for classic film screenings, attended mostly by elderly couples who sat holding hands beneath flickering projector light, while younger generations remained home staring into glowing phone screens. Even the church choir had become smaller. Funerals outnumbered weddings nearly every season. Children who graduated high school rarely returned after college, and every autumn another familiar porch light seemed to go dark permanently. Tom noticed all of it. He noticed because people who spend their lives behind microphones eventually learn how to recognize silence better than sound. Most mornings he still woke before sunrise and followed the same routines he had developed decades earlier. although now the routines felt less like habits and more like quiet negotiations with loneliness itself. Coffee at 5:30, weather report, birdseed scattered near the porch steps. Then long stretches of silence broken only by distant train horns and the ticking kitchen clock. Helen once insisted sounded comforting. Sometimes Grace visited after school, sometimes not. Teenagers move through life quickly, and although Tom loved his granddaughter deeply, he often struggled to understand the modern distance surrounding younger people, the way entire conversations now unfolded through screens, while real emotions remained hidden behind short, distracted replies. Still, Grace tried, more than most. One cold October afternoon, she arrived carrying grocery bags, while wind pushed yellow leaves across the porch around her sneakers. "You forgot to answer your phone again," she said, while stepping inside. Tom looked up from repairing an old radio on the kitchen table. "That thing rings too much." "That's because people are trying to check if you're alive." "I'm here, aren't I?" Grace rolled her eyes affectionately. The house smelled like soldering metal, old books, and black coffee gone stale inside the pot near the sink. She placed groceries onto the counter while glancing toward the living room where stacks of vinyl records sat beside Helen's untouched reading chair. "You've been listening to that song again," she said quietly. Tom's hands paused briefly. The cassette rested near the radio equipment. Even after all these months since rediscovering it, he still played it nearly every evening, sometimes softly through headphones, sometimes loud enough for the empty rooms to hear. "Maybe," he admitted. Grace leaned against the counter. "You know people at school are talking about it now." Tom frowned slightly. "The song?" She nodded. "Somebody uploaded part of the radio broadcast online." Tom looked genuinely surprised. "Who would do that?" Grace shrugged. "It's kind of everywhere locally now." That unsettled him more than he expected, because until recently the song belonged mostly to memory, something carried quietly by aging residents who still remembered the 70s, but now younger people who never experienced those years firsthand were beginning to discover it too, and somehow that made the past feel suddenly alive again. Later that evening, Noah Bennett walked slowly through downtown Ashbury Creek while taking photographs for his article. Although he had long since stopped focusing primarily on economic decline because the deeper story hidden beneath the town fascinated him far more than statistics ever could. He photographed empty barber chairs, closed storefronts, faded football banners, elderly men sitting silently outside the diner, and windows glowing softly against the cold autumn dusk. But what interested him most were the reactions people had whenever the song entered conversation. Faces changed instantly. People smiled sadly, or grew quiet, or stared into the distance as though remembering versions of themselves they had not visited emotionally in decades. Near sunset, Noah entered the small vinyl shop near Main Street, where old records filled narrow shelves stretching almost to the ceiling while a dusty turntable played Patsy Cline softly near the register. The owner, an elderly man named Walter Green, looked up from reading glasses balanced low across his nose. "You're the writer?" Walter said. "News travels fast." "Not much else travels around here anymore." Noah smiled faintly while browsing old records. After several minutes, he asked carefully, "What was so special about that song?" Walter studied him for a long moment before answering. "You ever notice how certain songs remind you who you used to be before life got heavy?" Noah said nothing. Walter continued quietly. "That song came along before this town started losing itself. Outside the shop window, evening settled slowly across Ashbury Creek, while street lights flickered awake one by one beneath drifting autumn mist. And for the first time since arriving, Noah began to understand that the story he was chasing was not really about a missing songwriter at all. It was about memory, about what happens to people when the last surviving pieces of their youth begin disappearing one by one. And somewhere nearby, inside his dimly lit house, beside the railroad tracks, Tom Whitaker sat alone once again, listening to Daniel's voice drift softly through old speakers. While rain began falling gently outside, the song ended. Silence returned. Then suddenly, through the static crackle near the end of the cassette, Tom heard something he had never noticed before. A voice, faint, almost impossible to hear, but unmistakably real. And the moment he realized what the voice was saying, the blood slowly drained from his face. The rain continued through most of the night after Tom discovered the faint hidden voice buried beneath the static at the end of the cassette, and by morning Ashbury Creek seemed wrapped inside a grey drifting fog that softened the outlines of houses, telephone poles, and empty streets until the entire town looked less like a real place and more like an old memory struggling to remain visible before disappearing completely. Tom barely slept. Long after midnight, he remained seated beside the cassette player in the dim living room, while the yellow glow of a single table lamp stretched weakly across stacks of vinyl records and old photographs. And again he replayed the final seconds of the tape with trembling concentration, each time leaning closer toward the speaker as the static crackled softly before that nearly inaudible voice emerged from somewhere deep beneath the recording. "Don't let her forget me." The words were faint, broken, almost swallowed entirely by tape hiss, yet unmistakably real. Tom sat motionless afterward, while rain tapped softly against the windows, and the old clock above the fireplace ticked through the silence with unbearable steadiness, because the voice belonged to Daniel. And for the first time in 40 years, Tom realized the cassette might contain more than music. It might contain a goodbye. The realization unsettled him so deeply that by dawn he finally turned the tape off and walked onto the porch carrying a fresh cup of black coffee, while cold mist drifted slowly through the trees surrounding the railroad tracks behind the house. Everything felt strangely quieter than usual, as though the town itself were holding its breath. A freight train passed somewhere beyond the fog, its distant horn echoing mournfully across the valley before fading into silence once again. Tom stared into the grey morning while old memories continued surfacing one after another with painful clarity. Daniel laughing softly beside the lake, Evelyn listening to him play piano inside the church basement, that final phone call during the storm, and now this voice hidden inside the tape all along. Don't let her forget me. Tom closed his eyes briefly, because deep down he already knew exactly who Daniel had been speaking about. That same afternoon, Grace Whittaker climbed the narrow attic stairs inside her mother's house while carrying a flashlight between her teeth and muttering quietly to herself about ancient family junk, because her mother had finally decided it was time to clean the attic before winter arrived, and as the youngest person in the family, Grace had apparently been volunteered for the task without meaningful discussion. The attic smelled like dust, cardboard, cedarwood, and forgotten years. Weak daylight slipped through a small circular window near the roof, illuminating floating particles of dust that drifted lazily through the cold air, while old furniture sat beneath white sheets like silent ghosts waiting patiently in darkness. Grace moved carefully between boxes labelled in faded marker, Christmas lights, Helen's dishes, old school records Tom, radio stuff. She rolled her eyes slightly. Her grandfather had saved everything, every newspaper clipping, every photograph, every broken radio. Sometimes it felt less like he lived in the present, and more like he spent his life preserving pieces of vanished time nobody else remembered anymore. Still, there was something comforting about it too, even if she rarely admitted that aloud. Grace pushed aside an old standing lamp and noticed a smaller wooden box hidden behind several stacked blankets near the back wall. Unlike the other containers, this one had no label. She frowned curiously and pulled it closer. Dust covered the lid so thickly that her fingers left clean streaks across the surface when she touched it. The box was surprisingly heavy. For a moment she hesitated, then slowly opened it. Inside were letters, dozens of them, carefully tied together with faded blue ribbon. Beneath the letters rested several old photographs, newspaper clippings, and what appeared to be handwritten music sheets, yellowed with age. Grace picked up the first envelope carefully. The handwriting across the front immediately caught her attention. Evelyn. Her eyes widened slightly. Every letter was addressed to Evelyn Harper, and every return signature simply read, D. Grace sat cross-legged on the attic floor, while rain tapped softly against the roof overhead, and although she initially intended only to glance briefly through the contents before returning downstairs, within minutes she found herself completely absorbed by the strange emotional gravity hidden inside those fragile envelopes. The letters were beautiful, not dramatic or overly poetic in the way modern movies often portrayed romance, but honest in a quieter and somehow more devastating way. One read, "Sometimes I think songs only exist because people are afraid memories disappear too easily." Another, "When I play for her, the whole room feels less lonely." And another, written in shakier handwriting, "If I leave before winter, promise me you won't let the town forget the music." Grace swallowed slowly. She recognized the song title scribbled across one of the pages, October Rain. Her heartbeat quickened. The attic suddenly felt smaller somehow, more important. Then she found the photograph. A younger Evelyn stood beside Cedar Lake wearing a soft blue dress while smiling toward the camera beneath glowing summer lanterns. Beside her stood Daniel holding a guitar, and in the corner of the image, partially cut off, stood a young version of Tom Whitaker watching them both. Grace stared at the photograph for a long time, because for the first time in her life her grandfather no longer seemed like merely an old lonely man listening to records in silence. He suddenly looked like someone who had once carried an entire world inside him. And somewhere deep beneath the attic floorboards, the old house creaked softly in the autumn wind, as though the past itself had begun stirring awake. Grace did not initially intend to upload the video publicly. At least that was what she told herself afterward. In truth, she had spent nearly 3 hours that evening sitting cross-legged on her bedroom floor, surrounded by Daniel's letters, old photographs, and the cassette recorder Tom reluctantly allowed her to borrow after she promised repeatedly not to damage it, while outside her bedroom window cold October rain streaked softly beneath streetlights, and the entire house settled into the quiet, nighttime stillness familiar to small towns after 9 o'clock. Her room contrasted sharply with the rest of the Whitaker house. String lights glowed softly above her bed. Sketchbooks covered the desk. An acoustic guitar leaned against the wall beside scattered headphones, notebooks, and half-finished drawings taped carelessly near the mirror. Like many 16-year-olds, Grace often felt trapped somewhere between childhood and adulthood, between wanting desperately to escape Ashbury Creek forever and secretly fearing what parts of herself might disappear if she actually left. And now, sitting there with Daniel's letters spread around her like pieces of a forgotten life, she felt something she had never expected to associate with the older generation in her town. Connection. The cassette played quietly beside her laptop, while the soft hiss of analog tape filled the room with warmth modern recordings somehow never carried any more. And as Daniel's voice drifted once again through the speakers, "Carry me home through the cold October rain," Grace found herself imagining what it must have felt like to hear that song for the first time in 1974 beneath glowing carnival lights, while the entire future still stretched endlessly ahead. Without fully planning to, she opened her editing software. At first she only scanned a few photographs: the lake, the festival, Tom at the radio station, Evelyn beside the piano, Daniel holding the guitar beneath autumn trees. Then she layered fragments of the song beneath the images while adding subtle transitions and handwritten captions copied directly from the letters. Some songs remember people better than photographs. When music disappears, towns disappear too. By midnight, the video was finished, 3 minutes and 42 seconds long. Simple, quiet, honest. Grace stared at the upload button while rain continued tapping softly against the glass outside. For several seconds she hesitated, then clicked post. She expected almost nobody to watch it, maybe a few local friends, perhaps some older relatives. Instead, by sunrise, the video had already spread across nearly every corner of Ashbury Creek. People shared it through local community pages. Former residents now living in Florida, Ohio, Texas, and Arizona reposted it alongside emotional comments about growing up in town during the 70s. Someone recognized Daniel immediately. Someone else uploaded photographs from the summer fair. Another person posted an old radio recording from WACR. And by afternoon, Miller's Diner buzzed louder than it had in years. Noah Bennett sat near the counter drinking coffee while watching elderly customers pass phones between trembling hands, their expressions shifting constantly between smiles, disbelief, and tears as Grace's video played repeatedly across small glowing screens. An older waitress wiped her eyes openly. "I haven't heard that voice since I was 19, she whispered. Nearby, two retired factory workers argued gently over whether Daniel performed the song first at the summer fair or the church fundraiser 3 weeks earlier. Across the room, a woman in her 70s laughed softly while showing faded yearbook photos to complete strangers. For the first time since arriving in Ashbury Creek, Noah felt the town pulsing with something almost forgotten. Life, not youthful energy exactly, something deeper, collective memory, as though people who had spent decades carrying their nostalgia privately were suddenly discovering they had all been protecting the same emotional treasure without realizing it. Even Main Street looked different that afternoon. Neighbours lingered outside storefronts talking. The vinyl shop stayed crowded. Music drifted through open diner windows, and everywhere Noah walked, people repeated the same phrase, "Do you remember?" By evening, local news stations from nearby counties had begun calling WACR, asking questions about the mysterious song and missing songwriter connected to the viral video. Dylan Mercer nearly dropped the station phone after answering his 6th interview request. "You have any idea what's happening?" he asked Tom later that night. Tom stared through the studio glass toward the dark street outside where rain shimmered beneath street lights. "No," he admitted quietly, but that wasn't entirely true, because deep down Tom understood something the younger people around him still did not. The song was not merely becoming popular again, it was waking up memories the town had buried for decades. And memories once awakened rarely return quietly. Late that evening, Grace sat beside her bedroom window, scrolling through thousands of comments flooding beneath the video, while Daniel's voice continued drifting softly through her headphones. Then she froze. One newly posted comment had no username, no profile picture, only a single sentence. "I never wanted the town to remember me this way." Grace stared at the screen. Her heartbeat slowed painfully, because beneath the message was a timestamp posted only 4 minutes earlier, and attached to the account was a location tag, Ashbury Creek, Pennsylvania. During the days that followed Grace's video, Ashbury Creek began changing in ways so subtle at first that many residents could not immediately explain what felt different, because the transformation did not arrive through dramatic announcements or sudden miracles, but rather through the quiet return of things the town had slowly forgotten how to do over the years. People lingering longer in conversation, neighbours knocking on doors without texting first, old friends rediscovering each other across diner booths, and music drifting once again through open windows beneath the cold autumn sky. For the first time in decades, Main Street no longer felt entirely exhausted. The old vinyl shop remained crowded almost every afternoon as residents searched through dusty record crates, hoping to rediscover pieces of their youth hidden somewhere between faded album covers and worn cardboard sleeves, while Walter Green spent most of his days cleaning old turntables and answering the same emotional questions repeatedly from people who suddenly wanted to talk about the 70s, as though those years had been waiting patiently all along for permission to return. At Miller's Diner, conversation stretched far past closing time. Coffee cups emptied and refilled endlessly, while elderly couples shared stories they had not spoken aloud in years, stories about first dances beside Cedar Lake, late-night radio broadcasts echoing through summer neighborhoods, football games beneath freezing stadium lights, and small moments that once seemed ordinary before time transformed them into treasures. Even younger residents who previously viewed Ashbury Creek as little more than a fading town trapped somewhere between nostalgia and economic decline now found themselves listening curiously whenever older generations spoke, because the song had somehow created a bridge between people who had spent years struggling to understand one another. Grace noticed this change most clearly. One afternoon she walked into the diner expecting the usual quiet atmosphere of tired conversations and half-empty booths, only to discover nearly every table occupied while laughter rose warmly through the room beneath the scent of coffee, grilled onions and fresh apple pie cooling behind the counter. Near the jukebox, several older men argued affectionately over whether the county fair in 1974 had been hotter than the summer of 1976, while across the room an elderly woman showed faded photographs to two teenagers who listened with surprising attentiveness as she described sneaking out after midnight to hear Daniel perform beside the lake. Grace paused near the entrance. The diner looked alive, not younger exactly, but awake, as though someone had opened windows inside a long abandoned house and finally allowed fresh air to move through forgotten rooms again. "You caused all this trouble," the waitress teased while pouring Grace a soda. Grace laughed nervously. "I just uploaded a video." "No," the waitress said softly while glancing around the crowded diner. "You reminded people they still belong somewhere." That sentence stayed with Grace long after she returned home, because until recently she had always assumed nostalgia belonged mostly to older people, something sentimental and distant that teenagers politely tolerated during family dinners. But now she began realizing memories were not merely about the past. They were about identity, about knowing where your life connected to other lives, about understanding that entire towns could carry emotional histories the same way families carried heirlooms. Meanwhile, Noah Bennett found himself abandoning nearly every outline he originally planned for his article because the economic story that brought him to Ashbury Creek no longer felt remotely as important as the emotional transformation unfolding around him. Each morning he wandered through town, photographing small moments that somehow felt larger than headlines. Elderly neighbors sitting together beneath autumn trees, families gathering outside the radio station, teenagers listening to old vinyl records for the first time, store owners reopening lights earlier in the evening simply because people had started walking downtown again. The town itself seemed to breathe differently, Even the silence had changed. One cold Thursday evening, Noah entered WACR 101.7, carrying camera equipment, while soft rain drifted against the station windows, and Tom sat alone inside Studio A, adjusting an old microphone beneath the amber glow of dim overhead lights. The room smelled faintly of coffee, dust, and warm electronics. "You've become difficult to find," Noah said, while setting his notebook onto the desk. Tom smiled faintly without looking up. "Been busy." "With what?" Tom gestured vaguely toward the window, listening. Noah sat across from him. "For what?" Tom hesitated, then quietly replied, "For whether the town sounds alive again." The answer settled heavily between them, because Noah understood exactly what he meant. For several moments, only the soft hum of radio equipment filled the studio, while Daniel's song played quietly through nearby speakers. Finally, Noah spoke again. "Do you think he's still here?" Tom's hand stopped moving. The hidden comment beneath Grace's video had unsettled all of them more than anyone openly admitted. Nobody knew whether it was truly Daniel, a cruel joke, or someone pretending, yet the possibility lingered heavily over the town like approaching weather. Tom stared through the studio glass toward Main Street, where distant headlights moved slowly through the rain. Then he answered quietly, "Some people disappear because they want to be forgotten." Noah frowned slightly. "And Daniel?" Tom lowered his eyes. "I think he disappeared because he believed forgetting was safer." Outside, rain tapped steadily against the station windows, while somewhere across town, Grace sat alone in her bedroom, replaying the anonymous comment over and over beneath the glow of her laptop screen, unable to escape the growing feeling that the story everyone thought belonged to the past might not be over at all. The idea for the concert began almost accidentally, the way many important things in small towns often begin, not through official planning or ambitious speeches, but through ordinary conversations repeated enough times by enough people that eventually they stop sounding like ideas and start sounding inevitable. At first, someone mentioned it casually inside Miller's diner. Then another person brought it up at church after choir practice. By the following week, handwritten flyers had already appeared in storefront windows announcing one night only Ashbury Creek Community Concert, honoring the music that brought us together. Nobody seemed entirely certain who organized it. The town simply moved toward it collectively, as though the music itself had quietly persuaded people to build something before the feeling disappeared again. Preparations transformed Main Street almost overnight. Volunteers cleaned the old town square, where Christmas parades used to pass decades earlier before attendance slowly dwindled. Local electricians repaired strings of overhead festival lights that had remained boxed away inside storage closets for years. Teenagers painted wooden signs, while retired factory workers assembled the stage with the careful seriousness of men rebuilding something far more important than lumber and nails. Even businesses that normally close before sunset began staying open late to support the event. For the first time in years, Ashbury Creek looked busy after dark. Tom watched all of it unfold with emotions he struggled to name. Part of him felt deeply moved seeing the town alive again. Another part carried growing unease, because every passing day seemed to pull buried memories closer toward the surface, and despite the warmth returning to Ashbury Creek, Tom could not shake the feeling that the concert was building towards something larger than celebration, especially after the comment, especially after hearing Daniel's hidden voice on the cassette, especially after Evelyn began avoiding him whenever conversation drifted too near the past. One evening shortly before the concert, Tom visited Evelyn's house just as twilight settled across town in soft shades of blue and gold, while cold wind carried the scent of chimney smoke through quiet neighborhoods lined with fallen leaves. Light glowed warmly through her kitchen curtains. Inside, the familiar smell of cinnamon and fresh bread filled the small house, while old jazz records played softly near the piano. Evelyn stood at the counter, arranging sheet music, with visibly trembling hands. "You're nervous," Tom observed gently. Without looking up, she replied, "So are you." He removed his jacket slowly and sat near the piano. For several moments neither spoke. The silence between them no longer felt awkward after all these years, only tired. Finally, Tom asked quietly, "How much longer are you planning to keep carrying this alone?" Evelyn froze. Outside, wind rattled dry leaves softly against the porch steps. "I don't know what you mean." "Yes, you do." She closed her eyes briefly. Tom continued softly. "The comment online, the tape, the letters Grace found." At the mention of the letters, Evelyn's composure cracked almost invisibly. Her shoulders lowered slightly. "He never wanted this," she whispered. Tom stared at her carefully. "You still think protecting him matters more than the truth?" Tears filled Evelyn's eyes instantly, though she fought them back with the practiced restraint of someone who had spent decades surviving through silence. "You think I don't ask myself that every day?" she said quietly. The room fell still. Only the soft crackle of the vinyl record continued beneath the dim kitchen lights. Tom looked toward the piano where faded sheet music for October Rain rested open beside an old photograph partially hidden beneath papers. Daniel smiling, young, alive, and suddenly Tom understood something he should have realized years earlier. Evelyn had never truly recovered from losing him. Not emotionally, not spiritually. Part of her remained trapped in 1974 alongside the music and the storm and the unanswered disappearance that changed all their lives forever. Before Tom could speak again, someone knocked loudly at the front door. Grace burst inside moments later, carrying flyers and autumn wind with her. "You are not going to believe this," she said breathlessly. Tom stood immediately. "What happened?" Grace looked between them excitedly. "People are coming from other states for the concert." "What?" "The video reached over 2 million views this afternoon." Tom stared at her speechlessly. Grace continued quickly. "Former residents are driving back to town. Hotels are full. The county paper wants interviews. Somebody from Pittsburgh offered to live stream the whole concert." The room fell silent. Outside, church bells echoed softly across Ashbury Creek. While twilight deepened over the town, Evelyn slowly sat down beside the piano, because suddenly the concert no longer felt like a small local gathering. It felt like the past itself was returning home, and somewhere beyond the darkening streets of Ashbury Creek, hidden beneath years of silence and unfinished memories, someone was watching it all happen. The morning of the concert arrived beneath a pale silver sky stretched low across Ashbury Creek, while cold autumn wind moved steadily through the nearly bare trees lining Main Street, scattering leaves across sidewalks already crowded with folding chairs, camera equipment, extension cords, and volunteers hurrying between storefronts, carrying coffee thermoses and boxes of decorations, as though the entire town had awakened before dawn with the same nervous heartbeat. By noon, cars filled nearly every available street. People had returned from places as far away as Michigan, Tennessee, Arizona, and the Carolinas, many of them stepping onto Main Street for the first time in decades, while staring silently at buildings that looked simultaneously unfamiliar and painfully unchanged, because returning home after many years often feels less like visiting a real place and more like walking directly into a younger version of yourself you once abandoned somewhere behind. Old classmates embraced outside the diner. Former factory workers reunited beside the courthouse steps. Neighbors who hadn't spoken in years suddenly found themselves crying together over paper cups of coffee, while Daniel's song drifted softly through speakers mounted near the stage. Even Noah Bennett, who had spent most of his career observing emotional moments from a careful professional distance, found himself overwhelmed by the atmosphere surrounding the town, because Ashbury Creek no longer resembled a dying industrial community forgotten by modern America. It resembled a memory fighting desperately not to disappear, and at the centre of all of it sat Evelyn Harper inside the small church near Maple Street, alone beside the piano, while weak afternoon light filtered through stained glass windows and painted soft colours across the wooden floor around her shoes. Her hands trembled slightly above the piano keys, not from age, from exhaustion. For 40 years she had carried Daniel's final secret in silence, convincing herself repeatedly that protecting the truth honoured his wishes. Yet now, with the entire town gathered outside preparing to celebrate a song born from heartbreak none of them fully understood, the weight of that silence had finally become unbearable. The church door opened quietly behind her. Tom entered slowly. For a long moment neither spoke. The familiar smell of old hymn books, candle wax, and polished wood surrounded them, while distant sounds from the town square drifted faintly through stained glass windows. Laughter, microphone testing, moving chairs, music, warming up somewhere beyond the church steps. Tom approached carefully. "You can still tell them," he said softly. Evelyn lowered her eyes toward the piano. "I should have told them years ago." Tom sat beside her. "Maybe," he admitted quietly, "but people survive grief differently." At that, Evelyn finally broke, not dramatically, not loudly, but with the exhausted surrender of someone who had spent decades holding memories too tightly out of fear they might destroy everyone if released. Tears slipped silently down her face while she stared toward the empty pews ahead. "He wanted to leave before anyone got hurt," she whispered. Tom said nothing, because he already knew, or at least part of it, but not all. Evelyn wiped her eyes slowly before continuing. "Daniel wasn't running from fame," she said quietly. "He was running from his father." Tom frowned. "What?" She inhaled shakily. "His father was violent, not constantly, but enough. Daniel left home at 17 after one particularly bad night and spent years drifting from town to town, playing bars and county fairs wherever he could find work." Outside, distant applause echoed faintly from Main Street. Evelyn continued softly. "When he came to Ashbury Creek, he told me it was the first place that ever felt peaceful." Tom lowered his eyes. "He loved you." A painful smile crossed Evelyn's face. "I loved him too." The words lingered heavily inside the quiet church. After several moments she continued. "The night he disappeared, someone found him." Tom's expression tightened immediately. "Who?" Evelyn stared toward the stained glass windows where weak sunlight glowed faintly against coloured glass. "His father." A cold silence filled the room. "He came to town during the storm," Evelyn whispered. "Daniel was terrified. He thought if he stayed, eventually the violence would follow him here too." Tom felt his chest tighten slowly. "He called me that night," Evelyn continued. "He said if he stayed, somebody would get hurt. Maybe me, maybe someone else. And then?" Evelyn closed her eyes. "He left before dawn." Tom stared at her. "Just left?" She nodded weakly. "But before he did," her voice trembled, "he came here, to the church." The piano keys reflected softly beneath her shaking hands. "He gave me the original recording of October Rain and told me if the town ever started forgetting itself, I should let the song come back." Tom swallowed hard. Outside, church bells suddenly began ringing through Ashbury Creek. The concert was about to begin. Evelyn stood slowly from the piano bench. For the first time in 40 years, the truth no longer belonged only to her. And somewhere beyond the crowded streets and glowing stage lights, gathering beneath the cold Pennsylvania sky, a lonely songwriter who once believed disappearing could protect the people he loved was about to become part of the town again. By the time evening settled fully over Ashbury Creek, the town square had transformed into something almost unrecognizable beneath thousands of glowing lights strung between buildings, while cold autumn air carried the scent of coffee, damp leaves, cinnamon pastries, and wood smoke drifting softly through crowds that stretched from the courthouse steps all the way past Miller's Diner and down portions of Main Street. People stood shoulder to shoulder beneath scarves and heavy jackets, while breath curled visibly into the night air, and old memories moved quietly between them like living things returning home after decades away. Children sat on their parents' shoulders, wrapped in blankets. Teenagers filmed the stage with phones held high. Elderly couples held hands beneath glowing lanterns while staring toward the platform where local musicians tuned guitars beneath warm yellow spotlights. And above everything else, hanging softly through the cold darkness, floated the unmistakable, emotional electricity that only appears when large groups of people suddenly realize they are experiencing something they will remember for the rest of their lives. Noah Bennett stood near the edge of the crowd with his camera lowered uselessly against his chest, because sometime during the previous hour he had stopped thinking like a journalist entirely. The story no longer felt like material, it felt sacred. On stage, Dylan Mercer adjusted the microphone while nervous volunteers rushed around checking cables and amplifiers one final time. Tom waited near the back steps beside Grace, who held her acoustic guitar so tightly her knuckles had turned pale beneath the stage lights. "You all right?" Tom asked gently. Grace laughed nervously. "There are more people here than live in this town." Tom smiled faintly. "Good." She looked toward him. "You're not scared?" For a moment he watched the crowd quietly. Then his eyes drifted upward toward the dark autumn sky, where faint stars flickered beyond moving clouds. "Terrified," he admitted softly. A few moments later the stage lights dimmed. The crowd slowly quieted. Even the wind seemed to soften. Dylan stepped toward the microphone. "Good evening, Ashbury Creek." Applause rolled warmly across the square. Dylan waited for the noise to settle before continuing. "Tonight isn't just about a song. It's about memory, about family, about people we thought we lost, and about a town remembering who it used to be." The crowd grew still. Then Dylan looked toward the side of the stage. "And before we begin, there's someone who needs to tell you the truth." Tom felt his breath catch. Evelyn walked slowly into the light. Gasps moved softly through portions of the audience as older residents immediately recognized the expression on her face, the expression of someone carrying grief too long. For several seconds she simply stood there, listening to the wind move gently through the square while festival lights reflected in tearful eyes across the crowd. Then finally she spoke. Her voice trembled at first, but gradually steadied. She told them everything. Daniel's arrival, the song, the storm, his fear, his departure, and when she finally admitted through tears that she had loved him and spent 40 years protecting the silence he left behind, an overwhelming stillness settled across the town square unlike anything Noah Bennett had ever witnessed before. No anger, no shouting, only heartbreak, shared openly beneath the autumn sky. When Evelyn finished speaking, she stepped back from the microphone, while tears streamed openly down faces throughout the crowd. Tom moved beside her slowly. Then, without saying a word, he nodded toward Grace. The girl stepped forward, holding the guitar. Her hand shook visibly. But when she began playing the opening chords of October Rain, the entire square seemed to inhale collectively. The melody drifted gently into the cold night air, soft, fragile, timeless, and then something extraordinary happened. People began singing, quietly at first, just scattered voices among the crowd, older residents remembering lyrics they had not spoken aloud in decades. Then more voices joined, then more, until suddenly the entire town square echoed with the song Daniel once believed would disappear forever. Thousands of voices, young and old together, families, strangers, former classmates, widows, teenagers, factory workers, children who never knew the 70s singing beside grandparents who never forgot them. And every road we leave behind still leads us back some day. Tears rolled freely down Tom's face as he looked across the crowd glowing beneath lantern light and drifting autumn mist, because for the first time since Helen died, for the first time since Daniel vanished, for the first time in decades, Ashbury Creek no longer sounded lonely, and somewhere far beyond the edge of town, parked quietly beside a dark stretch of highway beneath the cold Pennsylvania night, an older man with silver beginning to touch his dark hair sat alone inside a weathered pickup truck, listening to the live stream through weak radio speakers, while tears slipped silently down his face. Winter arrived gently that year, not through violent storms or sudden freezing temperatures, but through slow, quiet mornings where frost gathered along porch railings and chimney smoke drifted lazily above rooftops, while Ashbury Creek settled into the softer rhythm that always followed autumn. Yet despite the changing season, something fundamental inside the town remained different after the concert. Alive, not perfectly healed, not magically restored. The factory still stood abandoned near the railroad tracks. Some storefronts remained empty. People still carried grief. But now the silence felt shared rather than isolating, and that small difference altered everything. Main Street stayed busier through December than anyone could remember in years. The diner extended evening hours again. The old movie theatre reopened weekly screenings permanently. The vinyl shop started hosting live music on Fridays. Even the church choir gained new members after younger residents unexpectedly began attending rehearsals simply because they wanted to feel connected to something older than themselves. And somehow, quietly, without official announcements or grand explanations, Daniel's song became woven permanently back into the life of the town. People played it at weddings, at Christmas gatherings, at retirement parties, at late-night kitchen tables where old friends sat drinking coffee while snow drifted softly beyond fogged windows. The music no longer belonged to loss alone. It belonged to survival. One snowy evening shortly before Christmas, Noah Bennett sat inside Miller's diner finishing the final draft of his article while soft holiday lights glowed through the windows and distant laughter drifted from nearby booths crowded with families escaping the cold. The headline on his screen read, "The Town That Remembered Itself." He stared at the title for several moments before smiling faintly, because for once in his career, the story he wrote actually felt true. Across town, Grace sat in her bedroom recording music into an old microphone Tom had restored for her from the radio station archives. And although she still dreamed occasionally about leaving Ashbury Creek someday, the dream no longer carried the same desperation it once had. Now she understood something she hadn't before. Leaving a place and forgetting it were not the same thing. And downstairs, Thomas Whitaker sat alone on the porch, wrapped in his heavy flannel jacket, while snowflakes drifted lazily beneath the yellow porch light and distant train horns echoed softly through the frozen Pennsylvania night. A vinyl record turned quietly beside him. Not October Rain. Tonight he played Helen's favourite Sinatra album. The cold air smelled like pine, smoke and snowfall. For a while he simply listened. Then the porch steps creaked softly. Grace stepped outside carrying 2 mugs of coffee. "Mom says you're gonna freeze to death out here." Tom chuckled quietly while accepting the mug. "She said that every winter since 1989. Grace smiled before sitting beside him. For several moments neither spoke. Snow continued falling gently across the quiet neighborhood, while warm golden light glowed softly through nearby windows up and down the street. Finally, Grace looked toward him. "Do you think Daniel watched the concert?" Tom stared toward the railroad tracks disappearing into darkness beyond the trees. Then slowly, almost imperceptibly, he smiled. "Yes," he said softly, "I think he did." The wind moved gently through the night. Inside nearby houses, music played softly beneath Christmas lights and family conversations, while Ashbury Creek settled peacefully into winter, carrying something it had almost lost forever. Memory, and somewhere, perhaps farther down some lonely highway, or inside another quiet town, hidden beneath another cold December sky, a forgotten songwriter who once believed disappearing could protect the people he loved, finally understood something beautiful that only time could teach. Some songs do not survive because they are famous. They survive because somewhere, in some small corner of the world, they became part of people's hearts. And hearts, unlike towns or buildings, or even entire lifetimes, remember far longer than anyone expects.